Today we are going to discuss Socrates. Socrates is a teacher of Plato, and Plato is a teacher of Aristotle. There was Aristotle's student, but who didn't pursue philosophy but politics and empire building. It was Alexander. So Socrates, Plato and Aristotle put together created a considerable knowledge and philosophy. All this start with Socrates. See, Socrates lived in 4th century BC. He died or he was sentenced to death in 399 BC at the age of 70 years. At the age of 70 years. He was put to death. He was put to death by a council. So what is interesting about the political arrangement was that he belonged to city of Athens, and that was following direct democracy. Ours is the representative democracy. We elect people and then they in turn elect the government. But there the people were taking part directly. But of course, not everybody was taking part. Huge chunk of them were slaves and women were not taking part. So there was no equality in the city-state of Athens. But the fact that it was democracy means that it was quite advanced. And Athens, even otherwise, it was a very advanced militarily and culturally. But by the time Socrates was put to trial, Athens was in a very serious trouble. Athens and Sparta took in a war, and Athens was defeated in what is called Peloponnesian War. And after Athens was defeated, its democracy was replaced by aristocracy for some time, and then after that democracy came back. But anyway, the system that put Socrates to death was not aristocracy but democracy. Why was Socrates put to death? He was put to death on two reasons, on two grounds. The charge was that he was corrupting youth. And inventing false gods. corrupting youth and inventing false gods. What is meant by inventing false gods? I think it is giving them false ideals, false values, which are not in tune with what the citizens of Athens were being told. So it is on these charges Socrates was put to death. He was also accused of corrupting youth. And what did Socrates say about these things? Interestingly, he agreed with them. But not in the sense that he was accused of. He thought he was educating the people and transforming their soul, transforming their character by asking them to think, to reflect on the morals and ideals that they were taught. So he said that what you think is the corruption, is what you think is wrong, is my duty. He said, you won't understand if I tell you that that is my duty towards gods. My duty towards gods. That's what Socrates thought of his role. But what was he doing? Essentially, he would sit at a public place and he would engage in a debate with others. In what we can call Socratic method, Socrates doesn't lecture. He involves in a kind of a dialogue with others. Something like this. He asks, what is justice? One replies that justice is giving one's due. Then Socrates asks, suppose you borrowed a weapon, then should you give back? Then the participant says, yes, you should. Socrates asks, suppose he asks for the return of the weapon when he is angry, and when you see that he is planning to murder somebody, will you? Then the participant says, no. So then, returning what is borrowed may not be justice. So maybe justice may be more than that. So in that, Socrates is pointing out the given definition is either faulty or narrow or inadequate. What is of interest here is Socrates is not giving the definition of justice and asking others to accept him. Socrates is asking others to define and probing whether the definition is right. Whether the definition is right. So, there is no lecturing, it is about probing, making the people to reflect, question. reflect, probe, question what is told to us. It means Socrates is asking us to reflect on things without accepting the position that is offered to us. Start from the basics. And once we question things from the basics, many things of the society and many ideas of the society and the truths that we are asked to accept don't really look true. There appear to be some serious inadequacies. So that's how Socrates wants us to reflect. So that's what the Socratic method is. It is position, opposition, and then questioning, opposition, like that. Without any lecture. It is in a dialogue form. And these dialogues are written in the Republic by Plato. One very important source of Socratic ideas is the Republic. But that is not the only source. There are few books written about Socrates. But Socrates himself didn't write. And historians tell us what Plato wrote is not confined to what Socrates said. Plato did many other things. Plato extended, proposed many other things. So, this questioning of Socrates and his influencing the youth antagonized the authorities of Athens and finally put him to death. But Socrates' death itself became a statement of his philosophy. How did it become a statement? Here was a man who was willing to die for the sake of his principles. See, he would have said sorry. There are many alternatives to him. Sorry. Flee. Are you? He didn't apologize. He didn't say sorry. And when there was an option to flee, he didn't flee. It seems the people who are condemned to death sometimes bribed the jail officials and fled. But Socrates refused. He said the state should have the ability to make a law and implement it. And I have been a beneficiary of the state all through my life. And having derived benefits all along, I can't defy it, I can't escape it when it turns inconvenient to me. So he wanted the state to be able to make the law, implement it. But then he thought his duty conflicted with the state. And so he was willing to die. So the way he took death, he didn't want others to cry for him. And he took the poison and walked and then lied on the ground, and he was reporting that the poison was flowing, and finally at one point he lost consciousness and died. He accepted it cheerfully. So Socrates was an inspiration to many future martyrs. Gandhi himself wanted a death like that. And we know Gandhi also made a statement through his death. Gandhi was so inspired by Socrates' trial that he translated Plato's book on it into Gujarati. So one of the earliest martyrs was Socrates. So through death he conveyed the importance of rational outlook, skeptical outlook, and man's need to move away from the herd and seek truth, and willingness to die if such pursuit of truth is not allowed. These are the things that Socrates stood for. These are the things that inspired generations. What he stood for was one thing, and second, the willingness to die on the basis of certain principles is another thing. So he showed life was worth living only when it can be lived in certain ways, under certain circumstances. Life is not to be lived whatever be the conditions one has to live by. Life is too beautiful for such a purpose. So that was about the context and life of Socrates. But in this course we are interested in more specifically not about philosophy, not about politics, but about ethical aspects of it. We are interested in finding out what is it that Socrates has to say on ethics. Socrates' position is quite interesting on this. See, by ethical we mean all these things. We mean moral, just. To be ethical is to be moral and to be just. Socratic position on this issue is that, and with which Plato and later Aristotle agreed, was this: virtue is knowledge. Virtue is knowledge. We are not saying knowledge is a virtue. By knowledge is a virtue, we mean that knowledge in itself is something that has to be valued. That is a modern notion that knowledge is a great thing in itself. But Socrates was not referring to something like this. Socrates was saying that virtue is knowledge. That is to say, if one is good, it is because he knows. If one is bad, it is because he is ignorant. So he is not saying this man. See, normally we think people are good and bad. And if we ask, why are they good and bad? We say, because they are good and bad. Or that the circumstances made them so. But Socrates is saying, if one is bad, it is because he is not knowledgeable about himself. The statement virtue is knowledge this knowledge is not technical knowledge, not subject knowledge, but of oneself. It is about knowledge of oneself. So to Socrates, self-knowledge is what makes man virtuous, moral, ethical, just. Self-knowledge automatically leads to virtue. Morality. We often think that that man is knowledgeable but not moral. But Socrates doesn't think so. If one is knowledgeable, one is bound to be moral. He's talking about knowledge of oneself. What is meant by knowledge of oneself? Knowledge of what makes one happy, unhappy. Knowledge of what makes others happy, unhappy. So, if one has such a knowledge, then he knows how to behave with others, how to treat others, what to do and what not to do. And that makes him inevitably virtuous. Why inevitably? Because knowledge makes him to do certain things for his happiness. And what he does for his happiness is also what is good for others. So, Socrates in a way is proposing a unity of three aspects. Knowledge, happiness, goodness. There is a unity. Knowledge tells us how to be happy, and the pursuit of happiness makes us to be good, makes us to be virtuous. But of course, you can see that Socrates is looking at these three things in his own way. Knowledge of oneself, and goodness. Socrates is not saying that goodness or virtue is necessarily what the society thinks to be virtue or good. He thought he did a great job to serve Athens, but then some didn't think so. He was accused of corrupting the youth, whereas he thought he was transforming the youth. So, one's notion of virtue need not coincide with the majority view of virtue. That's one. And so is the case with happiness. Some people would say we are making money, maybe through illegal ways, but we are happy in this way. But Socrates would say that is not happiness. Happiness is of higher kind. Or you have not seen what is real happiness. So Socrates is saying knowledge is of something different, happiness is of higher kind, and virtue need not coincide with what others think to be virtuous. Of course, Socrates would agree that certain common things like stealing, cheating would be unvirtuous. So, given his definitions, in a way, there is unity. Knowledge, happiness and goodness. And this unity is common to Plato and Aristotle too. All of them have agreed on this unity. Others would say the unity between ethics and politics. But here I am looking at it in the context of purely ethics. So knowledge, happiness and goodness, all united. So what it means is that if somebody is doing bad, what is important is not to punish that person, but to engage him in dialogue. Let him find out the contradictions of his own behavior. Let him reflect. Let him realize that his behavior towards others is not in the interests of his own happiness, not in the interests of others' happiness, but of his own. So Socrates believes in transforming, educating, and he thinks that every person is capable of such a transformation. So that's how he looks at it. So he's not looking at in terms of good, bad, or condemned to be good and condemned to be bad, but rather knowledgeable and ignorant. So, the solution to immorality is education and not punishment. That Socrates would say. The next question is, how does one attain that knowledge? Socrates said that knowledge can be attained through the method of introspection. He made a famous statement. Unexamined life is not worth living. Unexamined life is not worth living. He says we should examine ourselves, our motives, what makes us happy, what pains us, what's not nice about us, how we may be mean, how our mind works. So examination here means not seeing whether we are following a particular code or not, but the examination of the code itself, examination of what is offered to you as truth, examination of your response to the situation. You know that man gets to know about himself through his relationship with others. Socrates wants us to examine the pleasure and pain of relationship. So, object to introspection. Object to introspection. In my opinion, this introspection will be objective and fruitful when one doesn't try to find out only what is good in oneself. If one is willing to see what one doesn't like in oneself, if one is willing to accept what is so-called bad in oneself, I think without fear, one can go deep into oneself and find out the nature of one's mind. And the nature of one's mind is similar to the nature of others. So understanding of oneself leads to understanding of others. So that is a foundation to wisdom. Socrates did that, and he wants us to do it. And such wisdom gives us roots into ourselves and to truth. And that wisdom to Socrates gave him the happiness and the courage to defy public opinion in the realization of his conviction. So, in a sense, Socrates wants us to probe into oneself without fixed opinion on what is true or what is oneself. That makes us wise. That makes us virtuous. That makes us happy. So, Socrates sees that unity. Seeing that unity, he also said, No one does evil voluntarily. No one does evil voluntarily. Evil is done out of ignorance. Ignorance of oneself. Ignorance of not knowing what makes one happy. So, to Socrates, ethical behavior is matter of introspection, self-knowledge and wisdom. Matter of courage, conviction, and the source of defiance. Source of courage. I think these are the things that Socrates stood for.